Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for hosting this forum and for our judges for your time reading our papers and engaging with it. My name's Eppa Rixey. I'm a PhD candidate in economic sociology, and this is my job market paper. So broadly, my dissertation explores this question of how can an underdog succeed in a policy arena? And this is a timely question because there are many important challenges today that involve smaller, fragmented groups going up against larger, more cohesive opponents. We see this with local bike advocates or affordable housing advocates going up against local corporations. We see this with state, federal, or global advocates going up against large multinational corporations. And in this particular research project, I'm looking at how smaller corporations compete against larger national corporations. So the small corporations that I'm looking at here are craft breweries. And craft breweries really succeeded through legalizing new business models that allowed them to go direct to consumer. And I'll explain a little more about this process, but to just show you what these businesses look like, this is Lamplighter Brewing Company here in Cambridge. They do about 4,000 barrels a year of production. A barrel is 31 US gallons. You'll hear me use that measure throughout this talk. They mostly sell direct to consumer. They make the beer behind the bar and they sell it to customers over the bar. And this model's grown over time, and perhaps the most successful example of this model is Treehouse Brewing Company out in Charlton, Massachusetts. This is their production facility. They do 10 times the volume of Lamplighter. They sell all of it direct to consumer, and the tap room really is the business. You can see the line of people waiting out the door. And this is really different than the business that I worked in before my PhD, Lagunitas Brewing Company, where we were primarily a production-oriented brewery. We sold beer through independent distributors and retailers, and we did about 1 million barrels of production annually. What's insane is that these two businesses have roughly the same amount of profit, despite one of them being about a 20th the size of the other. And part of that is because of how much money distributors make, as well as retailers, when you sell through a distributed system. And so I was really just fascinated by how small businesses were getting these regulatory concessions in the face of opposition from distributors and retailers that benefit from the status quo. So my research question is, how do small, resource-constrained entrepreneurial firms overcome regulatory constraints despite opposition? And the classic answer to this question is strength in numbers. But I'm really interested in how does an underdog build strength in numbers? Does it lead to policy influence, and what are the mechanisms by which it does? Some of the answers in the literature about how a firm might build strength in numbers include consumers. So this is sometimes described as constituency building, banding together consumers. Uber was known to do this through their app. Another way to do it is to band together across firms through a trade association, and maybe perhaps hiring lobbyists to bolster your advocacy. And then there's also the potential of building a coalition that spans beyond your industry. And often these are described as ad hoc and issue specific. So to give you a preview of my answer, consumers are important as a piece of this puzzle because they help to develop the resources to fund a trade association, think attending festivals or other types of events, but then hiring a state-level leader that has an enduring commitment to this process is really critical to ultimately then developing what I describe as policy partnerships. These are formal policies that bind multiple interests together long-term and create an enduring political coalition. So I'll describe all of that in greater detail. I'm going to run through my methods, the findings, and then the contributions. So the methods, this is a mixed methods study where I developed a comparative case study methodology. I started by really trying to learn the context in depth. So this included a single state study. That's the first chapter in my dissertation. It's a project called Bottoms Up. It involves craft breweries venue shifting to local regulators and using them to influence state-level policy. That project has an R&R at Organization Science. And then I've also did a bunch of interviews, archival work, and field work with the National Trade Association, the Brewers Association that represents craft brewers across the US. This process took about 36 months. And then I wanted to decide on a smaller set of states that I could study in greater depth. I created a cross-sectional database of various industry outcomes and demographic variables. And then I also looked at longitudinal outcomes over time. This was a fairly lengthy process. And then once I had my 6-state sample, I really wanted to validate it. It was difficult to get into all the nuance of policy influence for all 50 states. But for this smaller sample of states, I got access to a really unique data set that I could dig into to really measure policy influence at the state level to see if the variation that I wanted was there. And then finally, I built out full longitudinal case studies of each of these states, and comparing across them and doing field work, I engaged in abductive analysis, comparing what I was observing to what I saw in the literature and using that to build theory. So you can think of this kind of as a modified Eisenhardt methodology. It's a classic comparative case study methodology used in management research, where I used 7 large data sets, 52 interviews, and I did over 400 hours of field work. So circling back, legalizing different business models. Today, craft beer includes about 10,000 small and independent breweries that command about a quarter of beer dollar sales in the US. The first model that really helped to catapult this industry to growth was the brewpub model. It's basically a restaurant, and if you squint, there's a little brewery there in the back, but it's largely ancillary to the core business. This grew over time into a tap room, which, as I described before, is more like a bar. It does away with the restaurant component. Or a beer garden or a satellite tap room, which does away with the production component. It's just a bar that breweries run and serve beer. All of these involve selling beer to customers across the bar at a brewery, and that was illegal in all 50 states as recently as 1980. And the average state has a bunch of restrictions on the beer supply chain, and despite this, most scholarship on craft beer ignores this regulated context. So why was it illegal? Coming out of Prohibition, each state was given control over the regulation of alcohol. And what most states implemented is what's called a three-tier system that separates producers, distributors, and retailers into legally distinct categories with limits on cross-ownership. There's also a bunch of other restrictions. This is one that I came across during my field work that they actually implemented. I tested them on it. And the reason some of these restrictions persist or even were passed in relatively recent years is because distributors and retailers are really powerful political coalitions. Distributors are some of the largest private companies in the US, and retailers represent way more retail outlets than there are breweries in a state, so they can build a lot of political influence. Despite this, by 2022, we have over 7,000 companies focused on direct-to-consumer sales, but there's huge variation across states. In fact, there's actually greater variation across states in the number of breweries per capita than there is across countries in Europe, and I exploit this variation for a comparative approach. So here's my sample. There were a bunch of other factors that weighed into it, one of them being the lack of local regulatory agents to venue shift towards. So in these states, craft brewers really had to play the game at the state level. I also tried to balance the sample on a range of other measures, but the key sampling criteria that I used was the number of breweries per capita, in this case 100,000 population. So you can think of these numbers as about how many breweries you would have in a town the size of Cambridge. So when brew pubs were dominant, the average town that size would have about one brewery, and then with the rise of tap rooms, it rises to 4. And you see that all of the 6 states that I selected were above the national average in the era of brew pubs, but we see this really wide dispersion in the era of tap rooms, which is the focus of my analysis. So clear variation in breweries per capita, but is there also variation in policy influence? To assess this, I got access to a really unique data set from the National Trade Association of these state-level government affairs updates. I stitched them together into an Excel database. I have them from 2005 to 2022. It's about 5,500 updates. I coded them based on the geography. And then for the 6 states that I'm studying, I went through and I organized the updates into issues because there'd be multiple updates on issue as it moves through the legislature. And then I assessed the scope of it, the content, the favorability to craft breweries, and then the result, what happened with the policies. So I also hired an RA to code this in parallel. We had a really high degree of coder reliability, largely because the updates are pretty discrete and pretty clear. So this is what I expected my sampling framework to work out towards. On the right-hand axis here is breweries per capita again. I used 2 different measures. And then the left-hand axis here is policy influence success rate. So this is what percentage of favorable policies you're able to pass or what percentage of unfavorable policies you're able to defeat. And with this data, I expected states that have more breweries per capita to have higher policy influence and fewer breweries per capita have less. And what I actually found was that Arizona is a bit of an outlier here where they have a pretty high degree of policy influence. And we can look at the raw numbers as well, and the percentages are not really hiding something there. And part of what's going on in Arizona as I dug into the policy updates is that they can own bars and restaurants outright. And so if you include those numbers, they start to look a little more like the other states, but they don't show up as breweries in a per capita measure. So all of these states had trade associations that represent the majority of breweries in the state. And at this point, I was really puzzled by kind of what's explaining this variation in policy influence, and in particular, what's going on in Arizona. So I did some field work. I went to the National Trade Association meeting in 2022 and 2023. I also did a 19-day fieldwork trip across the 6 states in my sample, driving and visiting a bunch of locations. I got to observe meetings of the state-level trade associations and see how they interacted. I did a bunch of formal and informal interviews as a part of this process. And so I'll show you kind of, with an example of Arizona, how this data comes together to really get a sense of what's going on. So in Arizona, Four Peaks Brewing Company was one of the earliest breweries founded in the state. They were fairly successful, and they operated their business under a legal limitation where if they sold more than 10,000 barrels of beer in a year, they had to give up their direct-to-consumer sales. They didn't like this, so they banded together with some other craft breweries formed a trade association and were able to successfully get that raised, but their business also grew and continued to bump up against that threshold, and they couldn't get it to change anymore. So they hired this guy, a full-time director. His name's Rob Fulmer. And they tasked him with trying to get this limit raised. It took him 2 years, but eventually he succeeded in doing it, and he increased it 5-fold. And the way he did this, here's him to the left of Governor Ducey when this was being signed at Four Peaks Brewing Company. And I think it's so interesting. He's not looking at the governor. He's looking at this guy, who's the head of the Distributors Association. And it was a deal that the two of them worked out that said, hey, we'll limit our self-distribution, which is selling directly to retailers, in return for the ability to own 7 bars or restaurants. And so here's him describing this process, working cooperatively with people who could be his enemies and kind of chipping away at things over time. And through that, they really built a lot of policy influence. It led to this ongoing polycentric policymaking process of bringing together stakeholders across the alcohol industry. And craft brewers had a pretty strong voice in that because they were internally aligned, and then they built these external partnerships. So pulling out and looking across all 6 states, here was again my logic for sampling. I got this new data that said Arizona looks different. I'm really focusing on the favorable policies that are enacted here because that's really where you start to get these permissions. I tried to categorize the cases looking at both chronology over time, so when they formed trade associations, and their level of policy influence. And this led to this organization with Washington and Arizona as trailblazers, New Mexico and Idaho as successful followers, and Utah and Nevada as emerging followers. And here's that policy influence kind of on a slide. This is the cumulative number of favorable policies enacted. And we can see that Washington and Arizona had a sustained level of passing favorable policies throughout the entire data window. The followers, Idaho and New Mexico, started to pass favorable laws once they formed a trade association. And Utah and Nevada, despite forming trade associations at the same time as Idaho and New Mexico, really didn't develop a lot of policy influence. So I wanted to dig into these policies to try and understand what they were trying to pass. And there I found a clue to some of the influence, which is that in the successful states, a lot of these policies extend beyond the craft beer industry. And so there were 2 types of partnership strategies that I identified. The first is forming an alliance with a friend. I describe this as a taxation olive branch to partner with agriculture. This is what I saw in Washington and Idaho. And the other is more like the Arizona story, which is really focusing on converting opponents. And this often led to an ongoing polycentric approach of kind of horse trading and compromise across the industry. And both of these partnership strategies we see kind of across the states and throughout the time period. And in Utah and Nevada, they understood this strategy. It was very clear from interviews that they knew they needed an outside partner, but they weren't able to successfully implement it. Utah kind of tried. And if we zoom in on the pandemic, it was really interesting to me that these partnerships were essential to getting policies passed during this period of crisis for the industry, which kind of offers an additional set of validation of how these policy influence mechanisms play out in a time when craft brewers really needed to change the laws in favorable ways for things like remote delivery or other things. So these policy partnerships were really an outcome of 3 enabling processes. And I've kind of alluded to one already, which is directing. So this is having a full-time leader who runs the trade association. It helps if they have a long-term commitment so that they can build up these relationships over time and develop trust. But interestingly, it also helps if they have some amount of distance from the industry. People who owned a brewery were really not successful in this role. And so I charted out the leadership histories of the trade associations across all of these states and found that people with this kind of, I know the industry, but I'm at a little bit of a remove from it, like Rob Fulmer, who was the head of the Homebrewers Association before he became the head of the Craft Beer Trade Association. Partnering is really the outcome at the end of it, where you develop these policies that extend the rent chain of the industry. And in the middle is this process of mapping and really thinking about geographically, where are we strong? Where do we have breweries? Where could we find a partner that would help us to build out a more competitive map in the state house? So really, all 3 of these enablers kind of work together to support these partnerships and then eventually policy influence. So wrapping up here, what are the contributions for this work? There's been a little bit of work on trade associations in the field of non-market strategy, and they've largely assumed that participation alone is enough to develop influence. What I show here is that participation is insufficient. You need an appropriate level of leadership. You need to develop these compromises and partnerships, and that's really where you start to build sustained influence. For the literature on organizations and meta-organizations more broadly, these are organizations composed of organizations. There have been this assumption that the state-level trade associations really lead, and then the federal trade associations lead, and then state or local ones follow. And what I really show is that state-level trade associations develop their own approaches. What they did in New Mexico, which was really partnering with small producers to favor in-state producers, wasn't something that the National Trade Association even supported. And yet that was how they built their political coalition. And then finally, to update the voice of small business in America, this really shows us that smaller fragmented groups can succeed, and they don't need a ton of resources to do it, but they need time, creativity, and effort. So thank you so much.